Alright, so choice design, that's what we're here for, and I'm delighted to be here at AdventureX, my favorite conference of all, in a room full of basically people that love this stuff, so I'm super excited to be here. My name is Roussakoff. I am a narrative designer, technical designer, and more recently, game director. And I've been in games for a while. I entered the industry in 2005, and the last 10 years I've spent in narrative games. Amongst them, I work for Roussakoff Software.
One of the greats of the adventure game genre, where I was responsible for the Santa Cova scene in Broken Sword 5, and also went on to work on Beyond the Steel Sky as lead scripter. And this was the scene that I was responsible for as well, although a whole bunch of people contributed to it. And when the game was released, I was also nominated for the Game Dev Hero Award in narrative design. And whoever's responsible for that, if you're in the audience, I will kill you. After that, I went and became game director of this adorable gem, Paleo Pines. It's a cute dinosaur farming sim where you get to tame and ride dinosaurs and farm and have lots of fun with your friends. It has narrative as part of one of the core pillars of this game as well, and it's still in development. And then last year, I set up my own studio where we're developing Starstruck, an otome deck builder game. So if you're interested in that, come and talk to me about that as well. All right, without further ado, why choice design? Why did I become interested in this topic specifically? And this goes back to kind of my early days in the industry when, I went out with my colleagues, we went out to a pub, and the kind of like senior game designer sat down and he asked me, what's your favorite game? And I said, it's Planescape Torment. I'm sure for a lot of people here, you can relate to why that game's so amazing. And he said, oh, why? And I don't exactly remember what I said, but it was probably along the lines of, oh, the Society of the Senses was amazing, and this quest line and that quest line. And he frowned disapprovingly. He said, story is not gameplay. So I left that night feeling slightly dissatisfied with that discourse because I had nothing. I couldn't come back to that because I was like, well, story isn't gameplay, but there is something there, and I wish I had the words for it. And this was in a time when narrative design, wasn't a widely recognized discipline. So I couldn't even say, well, narrative design, duh, because we didn't even know that term. And what it did to me is I then sat down and I thought, I want to find the language. I want to find out, how do I talk about story? How do I talk about narrative with terminology that is, I don't know, acceptable to everyone? Which is why I'm here today to share with you kind of some of the things that I learned over the past many years through this sort of passion for games narrative, and in particular choice design. So when I started out and I was designing choices, I used to focus a lot on outcomes. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? The player, when they're encountering the choice, they're thinking about what are the outcomes of these different options. And it might look something like this, where you have option 1 that leads to outcome 1, option 2, outcome 2, and so forth. And if we take, let's say, visual novels as an example, you might have the bad end, a neutral end, and the good end. And we tailor it down to, let's say, an otome game where there's the death end, the career success end, and there's marriage, because you always want to get married, or at least fulfill the love interest sort of option that is there. And I designed, just for you, a special choice for this. What do you eat? So we can see if you choose the pear, you will die a horrible death of poisoning, okay? If you eat the banana, your boss is going to go, wow, you're so healthy, you're going to get a promotion. Brilliant. And the carrot, your love interest is going to say, I love carrots, I want to eat carrot soup every day for the rest of my life, will you marry me? And there you have your kind of approach to doing choices. But over time, I started focusing on the choice itself and move myself away from the outcome. where the context and the outcome are actually things that I consider during that moment of choice. And I'll dig into that a little more. So to start with, I want to talk about how does outcome relate to choice. In the moment of choice, the only outcomes that matter are the ones that the player imagines might happen. If the player can't imagine the outcome, it doesn't exist. I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? You might have thought the pear is the poisoning end, but as far as the player was concerned, they were just choosing what they were having for lunch. How are they supposed to know that they were going to die? So then that moves me on to the question of what makes a choice meaningful. And I know the word meaningful is highly controversial in games, and there are many definitions. I'm just going to add to the trouble. In the context that I'm talking about, the choice that a player makes, where the player believes that it's going to produce different outcomes. If they don't believe there's a difference, it loses meaning to them. And in the case of, what do you eat for lunch, if you don't believe that there are different outcomes, you're just probably making a guess, right? Or you might say, oh, that's my preference. So in order to create meaningful decisions, first of all, it's important that the player understands they are making a clear choice. And a great example of this in adventure games is, you might have different solutions to the same problem. There might be 2, 3 different ways in which you might solve the puzzle. And this is an insight, actually, I don't know if Richard Cobbett's here today, but if he isn't, he's also one of the industry legends in my view. One of the things that he said is, when a player plays and they've decided to solve a puzzle in a certain way, as far as they're concerned, that's the only solution. They weren't even aware that there were alternatives. They're not choosing to solve it one way or another way. They're just doing it that one way, and that is the only way that they know how. So the player has to be aware that they're actually making a choice in the first place for it to be meaningful to them. The second part is, how much information does the player have? If the player has no information at all, you don't know that the pear is poisoned, then how meaningful is that decision to you? You can't predict where it's going to go, not even remotely. But also the converse can be true, where too much information and it loses its meaning as well. I'll get onto that in a minute. The next one is, how reasonable is it? Does it fit within the player's expectations? If I create a choice for you right now, where imagine a scenario where you and your friend are starving, you're so hungry. There are 2 tins of beans, and the game presents you, life is a game, the game presents you with 2 options. One is you eat both beans, both tins, or your friend eats both tins, but one of you at least is going to starve. It feels like maybe it would be reasonable to have a third option in there somewhere. And that can sometimes break that sense of it being meaningful, because the real choice that you want to make as a player is not one of the ones that's presented to you. And last but not least, are the outcomes clearly different, as we mentioned earlier. However, not every choice has to be meaningful. There are lots of good reasons to include choices that are not meaningful choices in games for a variety of reasons. And boy, oh boy, you're going to get loads of different types of choices in a minute. But first, I want to go into a little example from Beyond the Steel Sky, just to frame what we're talking about. So if you haven't played this game, go play it. But there will be a minor spoiler here, and there'll be minor spoilers all throughout the rest of the talk about a variety of games. Hopefully none of them too egregious, so I hope you can forgive me there. We've got Foster on the right, who's the protagonist, and Mentor Alonso is kind of like a villain. Foster's impersonating Graham, and he's investigating Graham. He turns up at the apartment, and Graham's wife tells him, for both our sakes, you'd better convince the mentor that you're Graham, because otherwise you'll be in trouble with the authorities. Said authority. And after you resolve that situation, you kind of get away with it, except that Mentor Alonso is going to say, I'll be back. So there is still a lingering sense of tension. So what was the brief when we came to designing this? It was basically something like, get dragged into a mess, and profit. Or to break it down, we have the context, which is the protagonist has to impersonate someone, and failure can lead to trouble with the authorities. Then there was the design bit, and then there's the outcome, where the protagonist has successfully fooled the authorities for now. I'd like to point out that those 2 bits are a story. those are the bits that were immovable. We couldn't change those. The plot had to proceed along those lines. So we just needed to figure out how to fit in the gameplay in between those. And that's where I want to focus. So the second part of that was the interrogation scene that we settled on, where the player had to decide the best answer in a series of questions. And the feelings that we wanted to create in that was to feel a little tense, like it's a tense situation, to feel smart, that you're overcoming it, and maybe some light comic relief because it's a revolution game. In order for the player to be able to do that, we had to enable the player by allowing an amount of investigation to happen before getting into that interrogation scene. So in other words, we were creating a little more context for the player to find that was going to then frame the choice itself, or the series of choices themselves. So here's Foster walking around the apartment, looking at posters and various other bits and pieces. And then you would come into the interrogation scene where the information that you found would be relevant. So in this case, we have comfort was the correct answer, and the player would know this because we didn't allow the player to go into that scene without first having found that information. So we knew that the player knew it, so they just needed to select the right option. And that meant that we could guarantee that the player had the information they had. But also, there were some questions that were either optional or the player didn't have the information for. And instead, they were asked a question, and the wife of Graham would mime, sort of charade it. And so the player kind of had to figure out what that meant. And that introduced a very different kind of feeling into this scene. And then afterwards, the outcomes were basically either the wife, if you did it well, would be approving of you or disapproving of you, and that established the relationship that you have with Foster. All right, so where was the gameplay in that? You're not going to be surprised to hear me say that it's mostly in the choice. But also, sometimes it's in the context, in the finding of the context, particularly in adventure games and other games where investigating is sort of a part of it. Oh no. Okay, so I was afraid this might happen. We might have to go without slides in a minute. Well, we'll see how it goes. All right, so in terms of the context, I want to focus on that part first. The amount of relevant or irrelevant information the player has in order to make a decision when the choice is presented. Again, this is all really focusing on the choice itself, that moment of choice. So there is some context that's high level, the purpose, why do I care, what's my goal? There's a precedence, I'll talk about that in a minute, and then failure, what's at stake, what happens if I get this choice wrong? And they can change how you see a choice. In terms of precedence, I'm going to just draw your attention to The Walking Dead. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a spoiler to say that some people die in it. And when you first encounter that first choice, and particularly if you came at it without knowing anything, for me at least, it was really shocking. I was like, I must have gotten it wrong. I'm going to replay it and choose something else, and replay it and choose something else. I was like, oh no, I actually can't save them both. That's just not happening. And so the emotional impact of that initially is one thing, but then as you go through and you keep making the same type of choice over and over again, and people keep dying, and even the ones that you save die an episode later anyway, you feel differently about those choices. So precedence does create a different feeling depending on what's happened before. And this is an example from Emma, a Lady's Maid, one of my hobby projects, where I set a precedent that different styles of UI mean something different in terms of choice. So, for example, when you're presented with this choice, it means that's going to influence your game. But if you choose the other style, that's just kind of flavor stuff. All right, so that brings me on to how much information does the player have at the moment of choice specific to the choice, not the high-level stuff. I want to start with this lovely picture, and I'm going to give you no further context. And I want to know whether you're going to go to the left or are you going to go to the right. So show of hands, who's going to go left? All right. And who's going to go right? So it's about 50-50, unsurprisingly. I'm going to give you a little more context, okay? You're going to get a little more context. How about I give you even more information? Now, I'm going to ask the same question again. Who's going to go left? All right, and who's going to go right? All right. So it's about 50-50 again, unsurprisingly. One thing I found is players often do actually choose that option because some of us are adventurers or we wouldn't be here. All right, so in terms of the amount of information, if you present very little to no information, it creates a sense of surprise. It can also be something that leads to replayability, particularly in visual novels. That's quite common if you have like different routes that you can take through the game. Uncertainty, however, it risks upsetting the player for like, this feels really unfair. You know, I chose the pair, you killed me. How dare you? I'm not playing this game again. Some information is good to get the player thinking because they're like considering some of the factors, but they don't know exactly what's going to happen. And then there's the full amount of information, which is great for strategic choices, but it does risk being a bit boring if basically you're telling the player, do this thing, do this thing, do this thing repeatedly. They're going to lose interest as well. That's not that interesting. So here's an example from an Otome game where you have no information about what's going to happen when you do any of those things. I mean, practice pouring coffee isn't particularly meaningful. However, it does result in you talking to different characters, and that progresses your relationship with them on the common route. And that's something that's like a trope that's common to Otome games. It doesn't matter because it's for replayability reasons. This one is some information, but the player still had to guess. And then here's an example from I Am a Teenage Exocolonist. If you have not played this game or not seen it, please check it out. It's amazing. Not one of mine, but I love it. And basically, you can choose things, and it actually tells you exactly what's going to happen, right? This is a strategic decision for the player. They have all the information that they need in order to make that decision. All right, that brings me now finally on to choice, now that we've explored the two side bits. And this definition it's not a great definition, but basically it's a small unit of gameplay where that moment of choice offers an impact on pacing, strategy, player emotions, and/or player engagement. It doesn't have to be all of them, but it usually has some sort of meaning within your game, and it's serving some kind of purpose. Particularly, I focus on feelings. I always want to know, what is the player feeling when they are making this choice? So to break it down from a high-level perspective, we've got positive, negative, mixed, and both. So positive is about finding the best option, negative is the least worst option, mixed is the correct option, and then both can be a moral test. So what I mean by that is, if you have a positive choice, it might look like this, where which one of these is the best, and you've got 3 good things that you're happy about. They can serve the purpose of self-expression, including roleplay. So for example, from Paleo Pines, we've got Owen asking, oh, you're so kind, how's your new house? Have you worked out a plan yet? And the player can answer yes or not really. Does it have a significant thing in the game? No, nothing really happens differently depending on what you choose. This is not a meaningful choice. But it is a way for the player to engage with the content and have a space to express themselves in. This is, again, from Teenage Exocolonist. You choose what your name is. That's also a type of choice. And there's no wrong answer, unless you like to make silly names, which some people do, especially on Twitch. Topics, very common in adventure games. There is no wrong answer, but you do choose the order in which you want to explore the information. Or in this case, again, Teenage Exocolonist, you might spot a theme there. I really love the game. There's a few different things that you can explore in terms of getting more information. Except for the bottom option, which is a flirt option, in case you like that. All right, here's another example of topic-based choice from The Trouble with Earl Grey, another one of my games. And basically, you come into it knowing very little, and you have a couple of topics. If you talk to Earl Grey about Earl Grey, it unlocks the knowledge Earl Grey. You then go talk to Lady Grey, where on observing her, you discover that she's missing a locket, and now you have extra topics to think about. So those 2 topics were added, but also each time you make a decision, the clock moves. So it's topic-based, but you're limited in time, so you have to be smart about how you explore your topics. All right, next up is strategy. We've already seen this one. This is a strategic choice. The player has to choose which one of these meets their kind of gameplay requirements best, or indeed the example that I had previously. And there is no wrong answer, but it does set you up for what happens for the rest of the game. Next, we have confirmation. So sometimes you might find, I don't know if you ever find it sort of a bit silly that an NPC might say, do you want to accept this quest? But not in those terms, and you go yes or no. Why is that there? For what purpose? It's about consent. It's about making sure that you feel responsible for making that decision, right? If I say, yes, I will accept the quest, I feel a burden to actually act on it. But also, in some cases, do I want an information dump? Tell me more, or maybe I'm not that interested. Okay, I'm going to skip out on this. All right, so we have just a quick summary in terms of the feelings that it does. Self-expression makes you feel understood. Topics make you feel smart. Strategy, wise, because it's more long-term. And then confirmation helps you feel in control or feel responsible for the choices you make. Next up, we've got negative. So which one is the least bad option? That can be strategic. So this is from Frostpunk. The mines are freezing, and the lower levels have collapsed. Are you going to send 10 volunteers, and some of them might die, or do you abandon the lower levels? So neither of them are particularly pleasant, but they are strategic in that some outcome is going to happen that's going to impact you long term. The other type is the crisis type, which, you know, The Walking Dead, if you've played it, you get to choose who lives, or really you choose who dies, which is why it's kind of a bad option. And the interesting thing is I think it's a really good example of how you can separate outcomes from the choices themselves. At the moment of choice, the player's thinking, who's going to live? In reality, Sean dies every time, no matter what you choose. The only thing that this does is it sets a precedence for the player to not trust you if you do it too many times. So don't do it too much to players. They won't like you. So the strategic decision between two negatives makes you feel torn. And a crisis is just awful, bad, terrible. I hate it. That's why I play those games, because they make me feel bad. The mixed option is where you're looking for the correct one. So you have some bad options, some good ones, usually one correct one. And that leads to analysis. So in the case of Beyond the Steel Sky, oh, no, it happened. All right, well, I can walk through some more of them if I can remember them off the top of my head.
We don't have a power adapter for this.
No, I didn't have time to go and collect it.
Okay. Do you have an adapter for a Lenovo laptop?
It's okay, it's fine.
No?
Right.
Are you happy to continue without it?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay. It's white.
Moment of truth. Yes, it works. Yay! There we are. Right.
See, we got That's how you solve a puzzle. Okay. Back to Nina.
Next up, we've got reflex. I think a lot of you are going to be quite angry with this one. A lot of people respond very badly to time choices, but I'm going to mention them anyway. So one of the things we did in Stranded Hearts, which is a sort of survival romance sim, is have time choices in them, and they're styled like this. So they're quite simple. There is a venomous starfish. What do? Do you stand on it, step down on it, put a foot on it, or maybe avoid it? Then you have a limited amount of time to pick the right option, the one that's correct. There are different outcomes depending on whether you do or don't successfully manage to navigate this. But essentially, that's what this bit of gameplay is about. And the timing element inserts a feeling of tension into like a visual novel style game, which traditionally gives the player, very little of that kind of adrenaline tension. And if you remember from The Walking Dead, they also did this, but they did this not with kind of correct, incorrect type choices where it's a mixed. This is more ambiguous. So it creates a different kind of tension. And I think this is also probably the reason why people react like that to time choices. One thing that I want to add to this is what I thought was quite interesting and unique, of course, about The Walking Dead is that it's entirely valid not to answer. So with time choices, you actually introduce another option to the player, which is to let the timer run out. All right, there we go. So analysis makes you feel smart, and reflex type choices go, scary. All right, last one is a mix of both. So when the options both have good and bad things in them, and an example of this, so for more from real life, because you don't see them very often in games, is let's say you've just found your dream house, but you've also been offered your dream job, and your dream job is abroad. That's a really difficult choice to make, right? Because there are upsides to each one of them. You really want that dream house, you really want that dream job. But if you pick one, you're going to have to say no to the other. And the reason I call it a moral test is not so much because it's about morals always, but it's about prioritization of what's really, truly important to you. And so I've termed it dilemma. I don't know if this is official. But here's an example from Mass Effect, where you encounter the Arachnite Queen, and you have to weigh up the fact that, obviously, this is a species that wants to live on, but they have a long history of killing other species across the galaxy. And you can set them free, and they promise not to do it, but will they really honor their promise, especially several generations down the line? Or you can silence them, but then you'd be committing genocide, and maybe that's not right either. It's usually not right. just FYI. And it's difficult, right? In that moment, you have to kind of weigh up the good and the bad at the same time. So it can make you feel torn. It can make you feel virtuous for feeling like maybe you've chosen something that is bad for you, but good for the greater good. And it can also make you feel bad. So what about outcomes? I do have a bunch of quick list of outcomes for you to consider, but this talk isn't about outcomes really, but I just wanted to point out that it doesn't always have to be how I thought initially, that a choice leads to an outcome that isn't like an ending of some description. It doesn't have to be about branching content. There are lots of different ways in which outcomes can have an impact within the game that doesn't betray the player's expectations for there to be consequences to their choices. You can modify something about the protagonist, and indeed, the kind of Paragon-Renegade divide in Mass Effect is largely a case of role-playing the character differently. You can impact NPCs. You can build relationships with them. You can alter how they behave or what they believe about the world. You can have an impact on the world, and you could represent that by showing that the news has changed, or there are rumors going around, or indeed catastrophes that you solve, galaxies that you save, and so forth. The inventory can be modified. That's a really simple one, and we use that in adventure games all the time. Scenes can play out differently, so it doesn't have to be branching. You can just modify the scene. Very common in RPGs. And then finally, endings. Visual novels do it loads. I think there's a reason why they do it. Budget. And if you've seen Andy's talk earlier, then you'll know that budget's very important, and we're not gods. So to sum up, basically, is that for me, what I find so charming about choice design is when you focus on that moment of choice and everything that the player knows and feels and experiences at that moment, I think it's just so exciting, because you can divorce it from when you're thinking about outcomes or when you're thinking about the story or the context, and really focus in on what do I want the player to experience right now, right in this moment, right here. Do I want them to feel smart? Do I want them to feel afraid? You know, if you have a dark setting, pile on the negative choices all the time, you know, that's going to make the player feel terrible. That's what you want. That's why they play it. But if you're making paleo pines, i.e. me, don't do that. Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions?
Thank you, Nina. We do have time for questions. If I can see many hands.
Despite the slight disaster, we actually still have time for questions. That's exciting.
Testing, okay. I want to take you back to the image that you presented of the angry lynch mob. So you can, okay, so this was, you were talking here about the players' response to time-based decisions. So they don't like it, generally speaking. There is another element to games that are based on choice making, which is the reversibility or irreversibility of a choice. And I want to ask if, from your experience, you can tell me or us if people respond better to having the option, for example, to save a game and quickly load it after having made a choice and trying a different route, or do they respond better when it's, there's no going back? Whatever you choose is permanent. I know some games are doing this. I can think of Whispers of a Machine that doesn't really, there's an autosave feature, but you can't ever really go back and try again unless you start the game from the,
Kind of roguelite approach or a roguelike approach. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I mean, in all honesty, everything that I've said here is built on an experience of games where you definitely can save, you can roll back, you can undo what you've done. And I don't know whether people would experience these things differently, but the pitchforks come out even when you can save. So I can only imagine that in case of time choices, it would only be even more pitchforky if the decision is permanent and you didn't have enough time to consider it.
Mm-hmm. And you don't feel like that would devalue the choice? Because if a choice is reversible, then,
No, I think all of these options are entirely valid ways of designing games. You just need to understand what the player experience is that you're after. Some players will want that experience, and that might be built into what you want the player to feel. Maybe you do want them to feel frustrated and hate the game, and that is part of the charm, you know?
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks.
So do you think it's possible as a narrative designer to create choices where a player feels like they're playing as a character rather than necessarily just being themselves and thinking, what would I do in this situation?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think what I'll do is I'll go back to The Walking Dead, which I was really impressed with. I think it was one of the first games where I went, wow, every single thing that I choose, I feel like I'm choosing as the protagonist. I didn't ever feel like it was jarring or that the protagonist's voice was jumping around. I think sometimes, particularly, what game was it recently? I think it's, I've watched my husband play Cyberpunk. I've not played it myself yet. But when he was playing, he found it a very jarring experience that depending on which choice he chose, the character would act really differently. And he was like, it feels a bit sort of like multiple personalities in one character, right? And I don't know, maybe that was intended. Maybe that's exactly what they wanted, for you to feel that that's what the character is. But I think unintentionally, perhaps, it ended up, if you have too strong a voice for a character that's meant to be a self-insert, that doesn't quite work. But in the case of The Walking Dead, I think they did a really great job of Lee consistently feeling like Lee and answering things in a Lee-like way, no matter what the player choice was.
Do we have another question there? I'll go here if that's all right.
Hello, great talk. I love just seeing like the kind of this ontology of all the different types of choices. It's like making loads of notes is really good. I liked when you were talking about the Walking Dead example, where it doesn't matter if you choose Sean or Duck, that whichever one of them dies anyway. And you were saying like, oh, don't do that too much because then the player will not trust you. It sort of frames the design of choices as like a dialogue between the designer and the player. Do you think that changes when these choices might be procedurally created, like in more bigger strategy games like Civilization or Frostpunk or something like that?
That's a really interesting. You know, I loved. Can you say that again? It's a dialogue between the player and the designer.
Between the designer and the player. I guess.
I love that. I love that. That is such a nice way of framing it. Again, I've not worked with games like that. The one I'm thinking of at the moment is Wildermyth. where I think they did a really great job of procedurally generating a lot of things. I don't actually know how they did it or how it hangs together. But I think fundamentally what doesn't change under the hood is that if you think about choices in, I say like, as in isolation, and I don't mean in isolation from, of course they need to be embedded in the context and the outcomes, but I think it is useful to think, what kind of choice is it? What sort of mixture of things am I putting in it? Is it just a self-expression? Is it just questioning those things? I don't think that changes between genres or whether it's procedural or not. You can still design those types of choices in there.
Hello. Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. It's a great talk. You had examples there with just 2 options per choice to choose between, or more, all the way up to like 5 or 6 different options to choose between. Do you have any thoughts on what is an ideal number of options, and does that depend on the context, the type of choice?
Gosh, that's great. I love it. So the more options there are, the more the player slows down, the more they have to process. That can be a factor. I'm thinking of Planescape Torment, the question of what can change the nature of a man, right? That is what the whole game revolves around. And when you get that option in the game to answer that question, there is like a list. I can't remember how many, 12, I don't know, loads. You have to scroll to actually see all of the answers. But I sat there and I thought about it for, I don't know, what felt like at least an hour, but it was probably 5 minutes. But it was profound, and I needed to think about that choice and really think about how I was going to answer that. And in having all those options there and sort of really thinking about it, it was framed in that way, and it was appropriate for that choice. Do I think that should be done for every choice in the game, even the most trivial ones? Probably not. So I'd say like it probably is partly a matter of pacing. The other thing I would add is from research that I read about how people think of, in terms of how many options there are. Really interesting. 2 stalls selling jam. One stall had, I think, 3 flavors. The other stall, 12. Which one do you think sold more? It was the one that had 3, because actually people find it difficult and get overwhelmed when they have lots of options. They usually don't enjoy it as much as actually having it slightly more simplified. So I think you can take that into consideration as well. But I wouldn't say that there's like a perfect answer for like, if it's this style choice, you should have 3, and if it's that style choice, there's 10. There's no rules here.
We have time for 2 more questions. So this is a very difficult choice for me. I fell over while talking. That's embarrassing. Can you pass the mic down this row, please?
Thank you. A feeling that I didn't hear you touch upon, but that I frequently experience as a player, especially when it's a really important choice, is choice anxiety. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a way for me not to experience that?
You could not play games. I don't know, is the honest answer. I think maybe it would make for some really interesting academic research to find that answer. And I'm not saying that as a joke, genuinely. I think it's a super interesting question, but I definitely don't know.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we have time maybe for one more if there's someone at the back I've been ignoring. Wonderful.
Hello. Yeah, so one of my questions is regarding, so we go back to like the Walking Dead with Duck and Sean. So that's like the illusion of choice. What I really want to know is like, when you're doing stuff like that, because I know the reason why a lot of people do it is because, well, if every choice really, really mattered, then you would have to write so much stuff. But then how would you go about it, like, because for me, I feel like if it's an illusion of choice, I always feel bad. It's like well, what was the point of giving me the choice when no matter what happens, this happens? So like, how would you like go about like making it so that the player doesn't kind of feel like, well, what was the point of it if at the end it all leads to this kind of one direction that the writer wants to kind of go in?
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I need to cough. I'm glad it was just that one time. I was really expecting a lot more coughing. I think, so again, this is about whether you're betraying player expectations. And in terms of outcomes, your choice can still impact something else, even if you subvert the expectation a little bit in terms of the outcome that the player imagined was going to happen. Because remember, what actually happens and what the player believes is going to happen in the moment of choice, those are two different things. And the further away those two are from each other, the more the player feels betrayed by that, and also the choice starts to lose its meaning. But sometimes it can be really interesting and fun to experience that, right? Like something unexpected happens. You choose something, and I think if you sort of, what's the right word? If you don't betray the kind of smallest, most immediate thing, right? So if let's say you choose the pear, I'm going to bring the evil pear back. If you choose what you're eating, and you may not know that eating the pear is going to poison you horribly. Let's say if you're playing Long Live the Queen, there were lots of choices in there where you didn't know what was going to happen. But at least in the short term, when you ate the pear, and it was framed in the context that if you eat the pear, then it's going to make this person happy, and that person got happy by you eating the pear. The fact that you then also die of the pear is a lot easier for the player to kind of accept as something that they couldn't have foreseen. It's more so, I think, the choices where clearly you are making a decision, I'm going to save this character, and you've made that decision, and you haven't saved that character. Like literally that was what the choice was about. I think where the biggest dissonance is, and the biggest sort of sense of, well, that's not fair. But again, that might be a feeling you want to invoke in players. I don't think it's not wrong. It's just, what do you want the player to feel? If you want the player to feel betrayed, if you want them to feel like this game is really like, it's got it in it for me, I hate it. And sometimes that is valid. You know, we are making narrative games. We're not making necessarily other types of games, and a narrative, sometimes you have a vision for it, what you want to tell with it.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Nina.